Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, stories, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out the articles, videos, and more at passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, join the community forum, and of course, attend the weekly online Global Passive House Happy Hour. Now, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh and I'm coming to you from Auckland in New Zealand. We've also got some other guests on the line today. Let's start with Zach. How are you, Zach?
I'm well. I'm in Seattle and it's sunny, and Biden has just unveiled a very climate-friendly infrastructure package. So I'm happy.
Awesome. Well, we might get onto that later.
Yeah.
Because we've got some other great guests today. Mary James, how are you?
I'm good. It's also sunny here, which is not as wonderful because it's quite hot for this time of year here
already starting to warm up. Where are you at the moment?
I'm in Northern California, just north of San Francisco, where it's in the 80s already.
Wow. And we also have Ilka back on the show today. How are you, Ilka?
I'm pretty good, and I am in Philadelphia, and it is not sunny here. It's actually raining.
Yeah, we've had a bit of rain here in Auckland, which has been welcome because we've been quite dry. Although my son is on school camp, so he'll be experiencing a good outdoor activities and getting very, very muddy, which is all good as we're recording this leading up into Easter. By the time you listen to this, it will be past Easter, definitely past that shoulder season. Now we've got a great interview, and it's really good to have you back on the show, Mary and Ilka, today, because you conducted a fantastic interview. We're moving in towards talking about policy changes and how that can influence not just buildings but cities as well. And a lot of the conversation in this interview was about the benefits of apartments, and I guess the flip side to that is the downsides of single family living. And some interesting points in there. Ilka, do you want to just give us a little bit of background on some of the broader context, in particularly from Europe in that regard?
Yeah, sure. So Yael, she actually mentions in the interview that she read about a ban on single-family homes in Germany right now, and I actually didn't really know about it, but I went back and read some articles. And what happened is that in the beginning of 2020, there was in fact a ban of single-family homes that was put in place on the outskirts of Hamburg, in Hamburg North. And the reasons for it was that single family just takes up too much space, which, in Germany, we don't have that much of. And also that just building single family homes is just very, very inefficient. So, and I guess it was put in place because a new district officer took office, and he is from the Green Party. So, and it's just really interesting because, there's going to be elections coming up, and dependent on the presence of the Green Party overall, this might be something that can be repeated in the rest of Germany. But what I read, it's not really expected to be implemented in the rest of Germany, just because it's also very what's the word?
Controversial.
Yeah,
exactly.
How do you think that'd fly in California, Mary?
Oh, that would not go over very well. We are the
banning the
center
construction of
sprawl.
single family homes. But that's great, and it does provide some context just on how different policies can influence different cities around the world, and just how, and different mentalities as well. Just the ability to get a policy like that across the line just points to a massively different outlook on things. All right, I really want to get into this interview, some great stuff. But before we do, Zach, who we got to thank for bringing us the Passive House podcast?
Yeah, so our sponsor of the week is Innotech Windows and Doors. So I want to give a special shout out to Innotech. They're sponsoring today's podcast and then the rest of our programming this week at the Accelerator. So Construction Tech Tuesday and the Global Passive House Happy Hour. All of the work that we do is thanks to our sponsors. So I also want to thank our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Backstingui Architects, Glavel Foam Glass Gravel, Minotaur All-in-One HVAC and Dehumidification, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, RDH Building Science, StoCorp, and Zola Windows. And our stakeholder partner is NYSERDA.
Great. Thank you to all of those. And thanks also, and always, to our wonderful listeners and community out there who make all this worthwhile. Let's jump into this week's feature interview. So before we do that, Mary, would you like to give us a quick introduction to your guest?
Okay, sure. Yael Santopinto is an architect and associate at ERA Architects, where she leads their affordable housing retrofit practice. She was the project architect on the landmark Passive House renewal of the Hamilton apartment tower, as you'll hear more about. And she is also the director of research and partnerships with the Tower Renewal Partnership, a nonprofit initiative advocating for supportive policy frameworks around the preservation of Canada's affordable apartment housing supply.
So, welcome to our podcast, Yael. We are very excited to have you as our guest today. Thank you for wanting to share your thoughts and experience with us. So, you grew up in London, Ontario, and went on to study architecture in Montreal, Berlin, and Amsterdam. That's pretty awesome. So why did you decide to go to Europe, and how did it influence your perspective?
Well, architects, I would say, are often very interested in the built form of cities, and that's certainly the way my architecture training happened. But I always found myself much more interested in why cities are formed the way they are. Thinking of cities not just the result of architectural decisions, but actually as sort of complex constellations of politics, of history, power, values. And when you start to look at architecture as the result of those kinds of forces, you actually start to see very different stories. And when so traveling to other cities that have been formed physically by other contexts, by other histories, by other sets of values, really started to inform my thinking about some of the critical factors that maybe could be pushed, could be pulled, could be adjusted in different situations to create very different outcomes here at home. For example, in the 80s, Canada pivoted away from what was previously a very apartment housing driven model towards single family homes as the best way to live, quote unquote. But those were very political decisions, values-based decisions, a result of their moment. Whereas places like Amsterdam and Berlin, apartment living, rental living is extremely common and sort of driven by a whole set of other contexts. And actually, just recently it's come up in the news in Germany that different jurisdictions in Germany are starting to ban single family homes, right? So you can see there's an entirely different perspective on how we ought to live depending on where we are in the world.
Yes, different perspectives indeed. It seems like that just being exposed to the different perspectives and experience might have had an impact in coming up with the idea for your master's thesis, Griffintown Interrupted. And although this you did this in 2010, I think it's still very inspiring and relevant for what is happening in neighborhoods now. Could you tell us more about Griffintown Interrupted, or what you called an unsolicited competition?
Sure. So as I mentioned, I realized very early on that I was interested in the micro-political potential of architecture. And Griffintown is actually one of Montreal's oldest industrial districts, and was at the time just at the beginning of undergoing gentrification, a lot of new development happening very, very quickly. One of the things I was interested in was what are the how do we preserve the stories and extend the duration of the stories that exist there before all that change comes to the neighborhood? So Griffintown Interrupted was born. It was an international design competition that brought in designers, architects, landscape architects from around the world to do sort of temporary conceptual design interventions for Griffintown to tell those stories and give a voice to those stories. And while it was all paper architecture, none of it was built, it did actually have some impact in bringing attention to these questions. And it wasn't maybe even 3 or 4 years later that the city of Montreal brought funding to actually take some of those local intervention sites and bring funding to make them cultural hubs, right? So what I think was critical about Griffintown Interrupted was it really foreshadowed a different way of working in architecture. One that's more about convening across disciplines, across stakeholders, understanding those stakeholders' different priorities, their motivations, their challenges, and finding some ways to collaborate together to come up with alternatives. It's sort of a very curatorial approach to architecture, and in some ways very antithetical to the Starchitect model that has for a long time been very popular. And I would say that this kind of action-based, systems-based architecture has really been the foundation of the Tower Renewal work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I just wanted to touch a little bit on, how you see the role of the architect, that the architect is taking charge and more responsibility, which is far beyond just being seen as an aesthetic consultant who's just kind of waiting to get hired, right? You're proposing that the architect is a lot more proactive. Is this what you would call alternative practice models as well? And how does this concept fit in with the way ERA, where you work now, practices?
Excellent question. Certainly, I would consider this an alternative form of practice, and it's not one that's unique to us, but it is still a bit of an outlier in the architectural context. I would also venture to call it a bit of a feminist way of practicing architecture, one that's very responsive, contextual, collaborative, and that has many players, and sometimes it's hard to discern. It's hard to actually create hierarchies within, right? It's about constellations rather than leaders. That's certainly the way that we have operated at ERA in the Tower Renewal context. So when I joined ERA about 7 years ago, there had already been years of work done on Tower Renewal, led by Graham Stewart. There. Tower Renewal is sort of a 360-degree approach to social, environmental, cultural, and sort of local economic resilience within high-density apartment neighborhoods. And why? I mean, you can ask the question, why that typology, why that form? In Canada, in the years after World War II, the federal government actually incented a massive housing boom, in part a stimulus program post-war. But the housing that was built out of that boom between the late 50s and the early 80s was actually really inspired by European forms of housing. So the concrete slab tower block in the park, which is sort of, in a big open landscape, really became one of the dominant forms of development at that time. And I would say it's a bit unique in North America. You don't see that kind of housing typology, say in the suburbs of Chicago or New York, but it's something that you find all throughout Canada. And so, 50, 60, 70 years later, those apartment tower neighborhoods provide the bulk of our affordable housing in the country. They're fantastic places to live, but our ideas of what living in a city is, what is required to live well in a city, those ideas have actually changed a lot, right? So not just at the building level, where we need to build in climate resilience, new ideas about ventilation, and other modernizations that are needed, but also at the neighborhood scale, mixed use communities, walkable neighborhoods, having your corner store within 5 minutes of your home rather than within, say, a 5-minute drive. It needs to be within a 5-minute walk. And so Tower Renewal is an approach to actually modernizing, upgrading, and bringing those neighborhoods into the 21st century.
How do you go about bringing a neighborhood into the 21st century? What are the changes needed to make these neighborhoods even better?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'll kind of take a step back because I think it's interesting. Back now, probably about 8 years ago, we worked with United Way, which I don't know if you have United Way in the States, but anyway, they're a big community-driven organization to do interviews with more than 3,000 people living in high-rise apartment housing from the post-war era in the Toronto area. And what we heard resounding was people love where they live. They love their communities. They feel very connected. This is where the resources are. And when we spend time in some of the sites we work on, say in East Scarborough, in Hamilton, all across the Greater Toronto area, we see that there are really tight-knit communities who have built on these sort of apartment tower campuses really amazing local infrastructures. One community we spent a couple of years working with on some major site upgrades, has built apiaries on their site. They've built community gardens, orchards. They've got sort of a sort of local economy of selling honey, selling fruit and vegetables on these tremendous, very large open tower in the park sites, right? So there is a lot of robust infrastructure that's actually been built informally. One of the things that we were able to do, so I guess now 5 years ago, was work with United Way, with the City of Toronto, with public health organization, to actually do a whole-scale rezoning of more than 500 apartment tower sites throughout the city, to actually make space within the buildings pre-zoned or as of right zoned for local retail. These buildings were never conceived to be mixed use, right? And if that was happening, it was actually happening off script. And where local daycares were operating out of old defunct community rooms, they were actually being shut down because they were non-conforming uses. So this zoning change was able to actually open up that geography to say, if there's a corner store, if there's a barber shop, if there's a daycare, these things can actually now be legally operating as of right out of apartment tower buildings. And then some of that spilled out onto the site where even local farmers markets were against the bylaws. So those kinds of community changes are critical to the life of places, the life of apartment tower communities. And in the same way that the way we are building high-rise construction in our downtowns now, of course, depends on there being a drugstore or a grocery store at the base, right? It's just, we need to actually retroact back and make those adjustments to the sort of post-war neighborhoods.
Can you explain a bit about the Tower Renewal Partnership and the research you've conducted through that organization?
Absolutely. ERA Architects is our architecture firm and where we implement these retrofits. We have a sister organization, the Tower Renewal Partnership, which is a nonprofit that is focused on primary research, on stakeholder convening, and in understanding some of the systemic issues that may need to move to really accelerate high quality housing retrofits throughout the country. So through the Tower Renewal Partnership, we've been able to do some research with the University of Toronto, trying to understand that landscape. And we've seen that there are over 800,000 households living in aging apartment housing, and countless hundreds of thousands more living in newer apartment housing with our condo boom that will certainly also be needing retrofit in the not so far future. So it's a big number. Canada is surprisingly a high-rise nation.
You and ERA Architects have been guiding the retrofit of one of those towers that has gotten, for good reason, a fair amount of attention, the Ken Sobel Tower in Toronto. Can you tell us about it?
Absolutely. So the Ken Sobel Tower is a 1967 apartment tower in Hamilton, Ontario. It was a centennial project. It was built at the height of the sort of visionary development of the city, anticipating tremendous growth. And it's actually sort of a unique tower in the landscape and right along the harbor. It's been owned for decades by City Housing Hamilton, which is a social housing, affordable housing provider. At a certain point, that building was nearing a sort of end of life. Many of its systems and distributions required repair. And they took a very visionary approach to say, if we're going to reinvest in this aging asset, we would like to do it to the highest standard to create a model for what excellent housing quality should look like, excellent affordable housing quality. So they made a commitment to the passive house standard, with the EnerFit standard, which I'm sure everyone on this who listens to this podcast will know about, but it's the retrofit standard for passive house. And we were brought on to as architects to sort of see that through. But so the construction on the Ken Sobel Tower is nearing completion. It will be complete later this summer, and when it is, it will be the largest EnerFit building outside of Europe. So it's an ambitious approach to giving an old building new life, and it will be seniors housing, affordable housing once it's complete. One of the things I think that's unique about the Ken Sobel Tower is that not only is it a tremendous energy retrofit, it is a housing quality retrofit, but it's also a massive modernization program with all of the interior distributions being replaced, interior fit out being done. And so it will be essentially an as new building once complete.
And you're also addressing ventilation concerns that have become really critical in the last year, and delivering a just much higher quality fresh air to all the apartment suites.
Exactly. That was critical, and it was critical before our COVID context, and it's of course even more critical now. We know that this housing type was built using the standards for fresh air that were common at the time, which is to push fresh air in through the corridors and slip it under people's suite entry doors. But we know today that that's actually not very effective. And so one of the things we're seeing in apartment retrofits throughout the country is that it may be well understood that we need to tackle failing envelopes, and put in more insulation and make them more more high performance from that perspective. It's certainly well understood that we need to be changing out older boilers and HVAC equipment to make it more efficient. Those are understood concepts, but the notion that you then need to do a third thing, which is modernize ventilation, is, I think, still critical for people to understand. And anyone who is doing passive house work will understand the role that ventilation plays, but it's certainly not yet common understanding within the retrofit world writ large, right? Because you can actually retrofit a building to make it more carbon efficient, energy efficient, but actually make it a worse place to live because you've actually blocked off people's access to fresh air through their previously leaky envelopes.
Great, thanks. And when you were doing the retrofit or planning the retrofit of Ken Sobel, you also were thinking about embodied carbon, and just the structure itself has a lot of embodied carbon, which is one of the reasons that just tearing down these towers and starting again isn't the most positive solution. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. It wasn't so long ago that tearing down apartment housing because people, quote, didn't like it, or because, it was no longer the form of housing we thought was helpful, that was actually very common. And we saw that happening even as recently as a couple decades ago in Canada, in the States, in Europe. We now know that that's actually just not an option. In a Canadian context, we have a housing crisis. I'm sure just about everywhere has a housing crisis, but these apartments are fully occupied. There is no swing space for people to move to other apartments while we rebuild. There's no financial argument. We've kind of crunched the numbers there. There's no financial argument. It is always cheaper to retrofit than to build new. And critically, and this comes to the embodied carbon question, we looked at the Ken Sobel Tower because, we wanted to make sure that this was the most effective move from all those perspectives. We looked at it and we said, well, what if it was torn down and rebuilt as a passive house? And we found it would take over 200 years to make back the carbon as compared to retrofitting the existing building. And that has to do with the tremendous embodied carbon load that the existing concrete has, right? And so that concrete is in good shape. It will be in good shape for many, many, many decades to come. And retrofitting really is the most effective approach and can be done, of course, with residents in place. At Ken Sobel, it was not, but in many, many examples across the country, and we know in New York City and all over North America, we're seeing more retrofits being done with residents in their units. And
your firm and the Tower Renewal Partnership has particularly looked at this question about retrofitting with residents in place, and you've created a field guide to doing that. Is that correct?
Yes, we have, and you can find it on the Tower Renewal Partnership's website. Over the past couple of years, we partnered with ACORN, which is a Canadian organization that looks at a number of issues. One of them is adequate housing, has a tremendous membership across Canada. We also worked with industry organizations from the contractor side, and we asked everybody, what are the major obstacles and opportunities at all stages of the life cycle of a retrofit if you are doing construction with people in their units? And so the field guide actually looks at it from the perspective of tenants, from the perspective of the contractor, and from the perspective of the owner, and says at each stage, whether it be I'm considering doing a retrofit, what do I need to know, to I have a contractor in my unit, what can I do, what do I need to know? And for contractors many of whom are doing this for the first time, how can I effectively, efficiently, and with respect be doing this work in someone's home? right? And what we found actually as we were doing the field guide was we went and talked to different contractors, residents who had lived through construction projects that went really well, some that went less well, and we learned from that and have tried to put together some of those learnings so that, you know, we don't have to relearn those lessons again and again and again.
Now, one of the interesting, as you said, the Ken Sobel Tower is the largest EnerFit project in North America. And one of the interesting aspects to it is that you aim for such a high energy performance level as EnerFit. And you know, there are some others who might think, well, we'll just swap out the mechanical and put equipment and update that. And, you know, that's more cost effective to do that, but it doesn't succeed wholeheartedly. Can you talk about that a little more?
That's a really important point. One of the things that we need to always be thinking about in the context of retrofits is what is success for everybody involved. It has been the case for a long time that retrofits have been done purely to reduce energy costs. And there's lots of good business reasons to do that. When you look at that, so that may be coming from the perspective of whoever is paying those energy bills, right? From the perspective of policymakers, you know, we have set very ambitious goals in Canada around net zero readiness by 2050. We've set very ambitious goals through our recent national housing strategy around adequate housing for all Canadians by 2030. And from those policy perspectives, high quality housing that is low carbon is the priority, right? For a tenant living in their apartment, there's yet a third priority, right? So for them, it's probably, is my apartment moldy? Is it damp and cold? Am I overheating in the summer? Am I cold in the winter? Those kinds of questions probably matter most. What is my air quality? So EnerFit is a really interesting approach. It is not the only way, but it's certainly one way of actually tackling all three objectives, right? Those of the landlord, those of government and policymakers, and then those of tenants. And it does it in this incredible way. When we just switch out like for like systems in buildings, we're actually not making palpable improvements for the people who live there. They will most likely not notice those changes. When we start to tackle the envelope first, which is really the primary principle of Passive House, when you take an envelope first approach, you're actually meeting a whole host of other goals. And at the Ken Sobel Tower, that was exactly it. You know, there's 10 inches of new stone wall insulation, both inside and outside the existing cladding. There's triple glazed windows, there's new roofing. This was very much an envelope project. And then, of course, systems downsized to suit and a number of other quality of life improvements inside the building.
Kind of a naive question probably, but how do you support? How does that get funding from municipalities, or, I mean, how do you support that research?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, we've had a number of public funders throughout the years, and probably that the majority of the work has been funded by and supported by different levels of government. But there's also been a number of foundations and other community organizations who have funded work. Because it's not always been about the housing stock itself. And a lot of the work of Tower Renewal has historically also been about zoning changes to enable more local economy, more thriving local economies, and other kinds of work that really is about neighborhood scale and not so much building scale.
Do you have other deep energy retrofits lined up?
Yeah, we have completed more now than 1,500 units of deep energy retrofits in affordable housing. through ERA, and more are certainly coming. One we're very excited about that's just starting construction is a 3-tower complex in downtown Toronto that's affordable seniors housing, completed with residents staying in the complex, with certainly a deep energy retrofit approach. It is not a passive house approach there, but what we're really excited about is sort of bringing low carbon strategies to what is essentially a modernization project, an aging in place upgrades, community upgrades. And like I said, this is kind of other parts of the 360 where energy performance is just one of them. This is a project that really focuses on the social side.
Oh, that sounds great.
And you had alluded to in your Passive Canada talk that the deep energy retrofit market in Canada is changing rapidly, and I just and part of that, what you're seeing is that there's a difference in the availability of products that are needed for deep energy retrofits. So I just wanted you to talk a little bit about what has come onto the market in the last few years and what are the most critical products that are still missing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that we've been able to do through our work is go and learn from where other jurisdictions where people are actually regularly doing these kinds of retrofits. And certainly, Ilka, you'll know from the German context that this is sort of business as usual to be doing recladding and energy upgrades. Similarly in the UK, similarly in Japan, even in parts of Canada, like in BC, there's just more and more of an industry. And one thing that we see in all of these jurisdictions is just more off-the-shelf, cost-effective options. And so things like balcony enclosure systems, which are very common in a European context and can do a lot to mitigate thermal bridges of existing balconies, are on our market, but they are still quite niche and they are rarely used. So I wouldn't classify I would say most retrofit ready products are available, but uncommon and expensive. Along with that, I would say high quality windows fits into that category. Again, in a German context, triple glazed windows are actually, there was a policy initiative to make triple glazed windows less expensive than double glazed windows to incent the use of better quality windows. Here, the cost premium makes it so that nobody, unless they're pursuing a passive house certification, is going to go for a triple glazed window, right? Mm-hmm. So I would put that in the class of products that are available but difficult to use in constrained budget scenarios. The second class of products would certainly be things that just don't quite yet exist on the market. One of them is sort of a retrofit ready, all-in-one HRV, ERV type unit that you could actually plug and play, that's small, that would fit, that would be suitable to look at. So it's something that you don't have to hide behind a lot of drywall and bring a lot of trades in. Plug and play clip-on ductwork to sort of bring that unitized fresh air throughout the unit. Those kinds of things we just don't have available here. And what that means practically is that if you need to bring in new ductwork to circulate air within, let's say, a unit, you're bringing in your mechanical trade and then a drywaller and then a painter, and you've got people living in that unit, and it's just not practical. So where those solutions can be installed in one day, and we've seen that in some of these other jurisdictions, those kinds of products won't come to the market till there is a demand. And we see that demand changing, but we're just on the cusp.
And that's what the Realize, at least here, the Realize initiative and NYSERD are trying to push on both ends of the supply and demand, to make the demand more visible and more concentrated. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And to give, one of the things that we need to do for industry is bring industry to the table early. They are typically the last, and what I mean is the construction industry, the manufacturing industry, they're typically the last to find out when demand is changing, because they suddenly start to see a lot of projects coming. But what has been successful elsewhere is actually to say, well, let's give them advance notice. Let's give them advance warning that either regulations are changing, standards and guidance are changing, and that they will see an increased demand 2-3 years down the road, and allow them time to get ready. And that's really where some advanced thinking on the part of local governments, fantastic organizations like yours, can actually do that communication work. Certainly, we saw here in BC that after many, many years, in British Columbia, and after many, many years of sort of incentive type programs that would come and go, let's say a 2-year program, but government would change and the program changes. British Columbia was able to enact a province-wide code. And the Energy Step Code has actually completely changed the industry, because while manufacturers were not going to change their operations for what could just be an 18-month program, they actually could then have the confidence, because of the longevity of the regulation, to say, well, I see where it's going. I see that right now we need to do this, and in 3 years we're going to do that. And this is now the law. And that gives them the confidence to make an investment. I mean, I think, that kind of does speak to just one of the parts, though, but one of the parts that's actually driving change. So, certainly changing regulation is the fastest, in a way, the most effective way to create quick change within all parts of the ecosystem. But it's also, it's also extremely difficult. But there are other factors that are creating change and that are driving the increase in housing quality upgrades in our context. So one of them is our housing crisis. Sort of the lack of suitable, affordable, and mid-range rental housing in Canada has actually resulted in the government, for the first time ever, developing a national housing strategy and making commitments. In fact, they've made a commitment that by 2030, every person in Canada will have a suitable home. And what that means, and that's certainly a very ambitious goal, and one that we are keen to be a part of meeting. But that national housing strategy has actually delivered billions of dollars towards not only new affordable housing being built, but also the retrofit of existing housing. So that has been an absolute game changer, and it's been live for just about 3 years. And then the other piece is really, of course, there's our carbon targets, but the other piece is really that our infrastructure is crumbling. And where 5 years ago this was a hypothetical issue, today we are seeing catastrophic failures on buildings that are now 50, 60, 70 years old, with owners who are just not able to keep up. They're simply not able to keep up. So in Toronto, for example, a couple of years ago, there was an electrical failure on one apartment tower building that overnight displaced over 1,000 residents. The local shelter system was completely overwhelmed. And it was a tremendous wake-up call to the city to say, if one building goes offline, we cannot sustain the impact. So what happens if 2 buildings go offline, or 10 or 20? This is an urgent problem that we actually need to be looking at. And there needs to be some support to ensure that those buildings are sustained for the next generations.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And then you might as well upgrade to, the next step up and not just fix what's there.
Exactly. And I think people are beginning to see that makes sense. Like for like replacements are becoming sort of outdated. And I think that people are understanding the value of doing more holistic approaches to renovation and retrofit.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge and experience with us. And thanks.
Well, thanks so much for having me. We're so delighted that this accelerator exists, and it's so fantastic to be sharing this kind of knowledge across North America. So really delighted to be here. Thanks.
All right, Mary and Ilka, thank you for bringing us that interview. As I believe it happens so much, it's part of the challenge with getting great interviews is getting great guests, and you certainly did achieve that. Either of you, where do you want to start? What was some of the big outtakes of Yale's work and your chat with her?
Well, for me, I just have to, this is a little bit of an aside, but coming from California, where homelessness is such a huge problem, it really struck me her approach to renewing rental housing, which is such a critical supply to prevent homelessness. And it was so interesting what she was saying about how much the people who live there enjoy living there, because in the United States, I don't think I would be alone in thinking, oh, tall, affordable housing towers, not fun.
Yeah.
But clearly, this housing type in Canada, perhaps because they tend to be located in parks, as she described, have a very different feel to the community there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've been thinking about that for a long time, about how you make that type of living aspirational and well respected, as opposed to the bottom of the rung. And you know, people are concerned about just creating slums and things like that, where it's just so not the case when it's done well. And these types of projects are a real window into not just how to do it well from the ground up, but how to transform something that maybe has become run down and not very appealing into these amazing places to live. How about you, Ilka? What were the big outtakes for you?
Yeah, I think connecting to what Mary just said, I thought it was amazing when she talked about zoning change, right? Like when we talked about how do you make these places better, besides just kind of updating an envelope and putting in fresh air ventilation. It's not just about that. It's really about how do you create a community, and how do you make it, into a community. And what she said about, we actually had to change zoning for that, because the way it's been working with having a daycare, which is absolutely necessary, or having a little supermarket on the ground floor, that was actually not legal. So in order to make these,
or a farmer's market.
Yeah, or farmers were, exchanging honey, just to create these very livable spaces. You have to kind of go back and change the way codes look at them.
For me, that really underlines the issue that I strongly believe that it's evident that policy usually follows practice, and it requires people to be innovative, use spaces in a different way, and then it shows that there is a need for that, and then it can lead to, if our politicians are enlightened, then a policy change to allow or facilitate that activity, which clearly has a need. I think sometimes we sit back and expect a policy to be implemented that will lead to a change, but I just encourage all professionals to think about what is the change that we want to see, and don't break the rules, but maybe start thinking about how we would enact the result of that policy change to preempt the political decisions that can actually enable and then facilitate it to happen. And we sort of need to flip it around sometimes and be the change that we want to be. It sounds a bit cliched, but that's kind of the way it works. Zach, what did you take out?
Well, just following up on that, the rules changes. My sense was that there was some organic movement happening in these communities to create daycares that maybe weren't in compliance with rules, right? And maybe there were some other businesses. So there's already, I think my sense from what Yael had to say was that there was already a lot of energy moving in that direction. And so part of what the rules changes were doing were recognizing the value that the community was placing in these shared spaces already, and facilitating that rather than inadvertently discouraging it. So
yeah.
So I think that was, it's definitely an enlightened policy change for sure. I was really also struck by her clarity about the impact of the envelope first approach, that as opposed to the like for like swapping of systems, and how powerful the envelope first approach can be in raising the quality of life of people in the buildings. And I think it's something that's important for us to remember as passive house advocates, if we're in the policy realm. It's important for us to articulate that and remind people that there are certainly the energy and operational carbon benefits of passive house, but the benefits really do go much further, and that the like for like swap of systems don't necessarily make tenants' lives better. So while we're doing these interventions into these buildings, it's really just an equity issue for us to also make sure that we're making the lives better for people who live in these buildings.
Absolutely. Yeah. Speaking of carbon, I love that. And we had this before. I can't remember the last episode or talking about the time equivalency of carbon, because I don't know about you, but I find it really hard to visualize number of balloons or tons of CO2. They're just big numbers. But when you put it in the context of the number of years that would have to be spent in order to justify the alternative, that just, it's so clear. And she made the point that after, when you do the analysis, keeping an existing building, retrofitting that, is that to tear it down would be 200 years before you got that return on all the concrete that was there in place that was perfectly good if you looked after it. So I think that's a really useful way of describing and analyzing this cost benefit of resources. And if we could put it in the carbon context, then that's just a really useful currency for us to communicate these ideas with. And
I think that Yael underplayed a little bit the path-breaking retrofit that she was involved with, because it was
very modest.
Really discuss the technical details that much, but it's it was a challenging project for sure. And as she did mention, it was the largest interfit outside of within North America. So if people want to read more about some of the details, I just wanted to say, on the Passive House Accelerator website, there is an article about the Tower Renewal in the spring 2020 issue of the magazine.
Yeah, we'll add that to show notes, and also the happy hour appearance by Yael and Graham about the same project. Yeah, there's some.
That's a really good point, because it's very easy for skilled architects, engineers, consultants to gloss over things like, oh yeah, we did this project, and which sort of glosses over the undoubtedly long hours and heartache and arguments with contractors and consenting permissions, all the rest of it that goes along with some pretty groundbreaking stuff there. And as she also pointed out, everywhere has a housing crisis. I think a lot of cities think that they're the only ones with a housing crisis, but it's just everywhere. So to transfer that knowledge and have some of these case studies available, I think, it's a really good point, Mary. Ilka, any closing thoughts from you?
Yeah, I guess touching on pretty much what you already said, I thought it was really interesting that she, by renovating these towers, she was very clear about that this is what has to happen. There's really no way around it, because these are structures that are there. People are living in there. And it's the best way to build regarding carbon to renovate those towers. And she kind of pointed out that just by one of those towers failing, they already had a big crisis. So and that's going to happen more and more the more these structures keep aging.
Yeah, very good points. Well, thank you once again, not just for your time and conducting that, but also for finding great guests and bringing them to our audience. It's really inspiring. I find some amazing stuff in there. And my closing thought is that towards the beginning, Yael mentioned that architects should not think of themselves just as aesthetic consultants waiting for jobs to come to them, but they can have a place to lead not just the shape of a building, but the shape of a city. And that's a massive opportunity there for all of us. So create your constellation of experts rather than a hierarchy, and go forth and do good things is what I'd say. Zach, what have we got coming up?
Well, we have a couple of great events coming up at the Accelerator, and I mentioned at the top of the show that Innotech Windows and Doors is the sponsor of the week. So they sponsored today's podcast episode, as well as Construction Tech Tuesday. And Construction Tech Tuesday will feature Jeff Langford of JDL Homes in Vancouver. He will be presenting about From Code to High Performance. Should be a great show. On the Global Passive House Happy Hour on Wednesday, we'll have Mikhail Wasuf, who will present about a public school Enerfit in Barcelona. And he's a practitioner based in Spain. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about passive house schools in España. And then, of course, we've got lots of other great events coming up and educational opportunities from around the world in the passive house world. So we'll share links to all that in our show notes.
Thank you very much for all of that. Thanks again to our sponsors. And thank you, Mary and Ilka, for joining us this week.
Thank you.
Great,
Yeah, we
thanks.
can't wait
Awesome.
to have you back. These are awesome episodes. We really appreciate it.
It is great to have more people on board. And thank you once again for listening in to the Passive House podcast. We'll be back again next week with another great episode.